So if we just take a step back, ESA is the Endangered Species Act, and what it does is it requires the EPA to consider the impact of, among other things, pesticides on human health and as well as endangered species in the area and the areas where those pesticides are applied. And my take is that in the, let's say, the past several years, a lot of ways this has been ignored, and so the EPA hasn't met their obligations to the ESA. And now, as a result, environmental groups and other groups have used litigation to force the EPA to meet those obligations. And what that means for farmers is that now we're looking at more or less mandated regulation when it comes to pesticides that are not science-based. And so the EPA has decided to put together things like the interim mitigation strategy, which requires farmers to adapt conservation practices if they want to apply pesticides that are not based on any kind of actual research, but just instead on making sure that there's no impact on those species without any consideration for the impact on farming.
How does a farmer know if there's an endangered species in his area that he could get dinged for?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and actually, so the EPA is working on that kind of communication. The biggest thing that they can use now is Bulletin 2 Live, or Bulletins Live 2, which is an online website that you can go on, register, and then look at your area and see what endangered species might be impacting pesticide labeling in that area.
I know there's a couple of different ones in Illinois, at least the endangered species that the EPA has identified.
Yeah, so you're probably referring to the Vulnerable Species Pilot Program that the EPA just released a comment period on. And what that does is this identified 3 different vulnerable species. So this is species that are on the endangered species list and considered very, very likely to become extinct, so the maybe most endangered. In Illinois, we've identified 3, the most common of which is the rusty patch bumblebee. And what that does is EPA has said if they implement this pilot program, they're going to create basically pesticide exclusion zones where for farmers that have farm ground inside those areas to farm, they're going to have to consult with Fish and Wildlife 3 months in advance. They're going to have to adopt at least 4 conservation practices from a pick list, or they're not going to be allowed to apply pesticides in that area. And so this is concerning for us, because immediate effect, we've already met with several farmers that it impacts a couple hundred to 400 acres of their farm ground. So the results of that conversation have been that when we walk through it with the farmer, his comment back is, well, that just means I'm going to have to abandon that farm ground. And so that's obviously concerning to us because, we're talking about a very high level farmer, and if he can't farm it, no one's going to be able to farm it. So it impacts both the farmer and the landowner because land values decrease. And then the other implication there is that this is being put in place to protect the habitat. But what we're going to see, at least in that situation, is the land will probably be sold for development. And so the habitat will still be destroyed. And so we're looking at ways to engage with the EPA and these other agencies and say, hey, we respect your need to meet ESA obligations, and we want to help you get there, but we have to have a bigger conversation. And it has to include all the stakeholders, not just the environmental groups.